Thank you for joining us this evening as we're talking about mapping the boundaries of friendship, the changing nature and tools of relationships. And this is part of our Sharper Focus, Wider Lens series sponsored by the Honors College, and we are indeed glad to be here with you tonight. I want to get some preliminaries out of the way and acknowledge our co-sponsors because we would not be able to do this tonight without the panelists who contribute their time, their departments and colleges who agree to help us get the word out, and of course the people within the Honors College that do the work to make sure that it can all come together. And so tonight, co-sponsoring the event is the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Communication Arts and Sciences, the College of Natural Science, the College of Social Science, James Madison College, Lyman Briggs College, the Residential College for Arts and Humanities, the Department of Advertising, Public Relations, and Retailing, the Department of Physics and Astronomy, the Department of Psychology, the Department of Romance and Classical Studies, and the Department of Telecommunication, Information Studies, and the Media. And I hope that you see by that listing of all of the co-sponsors that this really is an endeavor to situate conversations within the university broadly, and to acknowledge that there are topics that touch on multiple disciplines and professions, and it's important that we take the time to have the conversation and reach out across disciplines and professions and figure out what are the connections, and that the Honors College is proud to be a part of that experience where we begin to have those conversations. And hopefully you'll see that we're not going to resolve the issues tonight, and that we hope that you continue to have discussions beyond tonight. I also would like to acknowledge John Beck, who helps organize the series and is hanging out in the back of the room. He does the yeoman job of actually finding all of our wonderful panelists and thinking about the topics. We also have Joyce Samuel here in the front, who helps with logistics, and I believe we have Becky Holbert in the back, who assists with communications. And so this really is a collective endeavor to come together and bring all of you and all of us together. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm sure that I didn't introduce myself. I am Dr. Cynthia Jackson-Elmore, the Dean of the Honors College. And so on tonight, what we will do is each of the panelists will take some time from their perspective and address the topic. We will then from there allow the panelists to have a conversation with each other, and then we're going to invite you into the conversation. And the third part is really important to us. We want to have a conversation with you. So we hope as we're going through the evening and questions come up, ideas come up, that you keep them in mind and you really do engage, because that's part of what makes this such an exciting event. And so on tonight, we're going to start with Dr. Nancy Marino, and before I forget, because I don't want to wait to the end, we already know when the next one's coming. All right, so mark your calendars. We have flyers in the back that we'll get around to you. If you did not get this, make sure you do. But the next one is going to be February 4th, 2013. It's Saltwater Encounters, conducting research beneath, beside, and across the oceans. And we're also going to give you an assignment. We're going to ask you to go out and help spread the word. If you've been to any others, you know that this is a fabulous opportunity to interact, and we're going to ask you to help us get the word out to others so that we can continue to engage. And I'm going to share a little bit with you about Dr. Nancy Marino, and then we're just going to get started for the evening. She is a University Distinguished Professor of Spanish in the Department of Romance and Classical Studies. Professor Marino is known nationally and internationally for her publications and spirited public presentations in the field of Spanish medieval studies. She is the author of 7 books and more than 30 articles, and we are pleased to have her with us tonight. Going to ask you to join me in acknowledging her and her presence tonight.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, good. As somebody who works in medieval studies, I've often, over the years, especially in the last 20 years, have considered how communications have changed very much from what was done in the 15th century and what's done now. And so when John Beck talked to me about participating tonight, I thought it might be a good way for me to formalize and articulate the thoughts I have about these things. I like to think of myself as commuting between 2 centuries. I commute between 15th century Spain and 21st century US, East Lansing. And studying people who think and relate to each other in very different ways than we do now, and using the technologies that we have now to think about how they communicate it. And especially in the last 20 years when email became popular, and I started really feeling that not only things had changed in both space and time. Lengths of communications had gotten much shorter, the speed at which we communicated also. But email is nothing compared to what happens now with texting and in Twitter. And of course, Twitter, where you have a limited number of characters that you can use, it becomes, to myself, an unrecognizable way to communicate. Because letters were necessary things. Starting in classical antiquity, and I'm sure way before that, letters were necessary because face-to-face encounters almost didn't happen. They were very unusual. There were few opportunities for those. And so official letters and personal letters became necessary as a way of getting one's point across. And so letter writers started to adhere to rhetorical conventions, ways that letters must be written. They had to start with a salutation or a greeting. You may remember some of these things from 4th grade, as I do. Okay? The exordium or introduction, narration, which was the elaboration of the subject, a petition in which a writer might ask you a question or favor, and then the conclusion. Okay? And as I said, I think I studied in the 4th grade in conjunction with my penmanship class, which didn't seem to take either. Okay? And so people always wrote 2 letters. People wrote the letter that was going to be sent, and people wrote the letter to keep, because you wanted to keep a record of what you had. You kept the correspondence that you sent with the correspondence that you received. And here we have, and we're going to be talking about an aristocratic crowd tonight, and here we have an aristocratic gentleman sitting at his desk in his aristocratic house. He's writing, of course, on probably parchment, vellum, and a quill. He's got his inkwell, and he's got a pen knife, and there's a book on his shelf. But also, we've got a lady doing the same thing. Okay? Women at this point, women in 15th century Spain weren't, some of them were poets, some of them got published, I'd say, in that way. But most of them were letter writers. And so we see this woman sitting at her desk in a place that looks a lot like my office, actually, if you think about it. A lot like my office. Okay? So you write 2 letters, okay, and you've got to send one. Someone's got to take it somewhere for you. So you need couriers, okay, and the people I'm talking about live in different courts in different parts of Spain. And so the couriers you write your letter, and it could take days, it could take weeks, or it could take months sometimes to get where it's going. Okay? The person's got to get the letter, they read it, they think about it, they write back. And so the time delay between these communications is something that is unrecognizable to us today. And probably, in a lot of ways, still happened until the 19th century, maybe even the 20th century in some places. Okay? Here's what a 15th century letter would have looked like. Okay? This one is a particularly nice one. I think it's written on vellum, calfskin, and in very typical 15th century hand. And so that's what you wrote. This one's a little more legible, I think. This one's actually a bill of sale. I had a hard time finding images that were actually personal letters. Okay? So that's what it might have looked at. Okay? So the person I've chosen to talk about, you saw his name up there before, his name was Fernando de la Torre, Don Fernando, we will call him. And he was one of the most active letter writers in mid-15th century. Okay? He maintained an active correspondence with men and women of several different courts. He was somebody we think of now as a Renaissance man, although the Renaissance hadn't quite made it to Spain in the mid-15th century. But he was very learned, he was well-traveled, he was a diplomat, he was a military man, he was a warrior who had been wounded several times in battles. Okay? He was a prolific poet, and he was a letter writer. Okay? A lot of his letters have survived because he kept some which have managed to survive, and also the aristocrats he wrote to kept those in their libraries. And he also wrote a compilation, or he wrote letters that ended up in a compilation of 20 letters and their replies that a noblewoman asked him to put together, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. Okay? But in a lot of correspondence, he mentions other letters that people had written to him or they to them. So we know that there are very many more letters that just he wrote that have now disappeared completely. Okay? Surely many more letters were written than we have extant today. Right? So he studied in Florence, which was sort of finishing school for aristocratic Spanish men in those days. And he spent a great deal of time in Italy, but he also spent a lot of time in France, 5 or 6 years in France, where he was a diplomat to the French court. Okay? And at one point in the mid-15th centuries, in 1452 or 3, at the French court, he became embroiled in a very heated argument with a French nobleman that became very well known. Right? And it took place at the court in the presence of the French king. And the argument was over the fact that it was about the political and economic supremacy of Castile, one of the kingdoms of Spain. Okay, an undisputed fact, which the French didn't like very much. But also, mostly, the dispute was about the French accusation that Spanish gentlemen were lazy. They were rich, but they were very lazy. Okay? That's also a fact, but it was disputed. It's very, very much so a fact. Okay? So on his way, oh boy, was it ever a fact. And they were famous for centuries for not wanting to lift a finger. Okay? On his way home, when he got back, he wrote a letter to the new king of Castile, Henry IV. And in that letter, Henry IV was not a very promising young king. He outlined the nature of the dispute. He defended Castile's honor. And he urged the king, basically, to get on with it, make good economic policies, do some good governance, and let Castile shine. Okay? The letter was written and then read before a court assembly. It was written in the Castilian court, before the kings, before the noblemen, and it caused a sensation. It was a very daring letter. You don't talk to the king that way. Okay? And so a lot of noblemen asked for copies of the letter. So every time you have to make a copy of a letter, you have to sit down and make a copy of a letter. Apparently, the letter went, as we might say today, it went viral. Lots of people asked for it, and there were lots of copies made. Probably the most useful material, most useful item to study or to think about Don Fernando's letters are that collection I mentioned before. It's called The Book of 20 Letters and Questions with Their Answers. Okay? It's a collection of letters that came about by request from a princess, the daughter of the King of Navarre, whose name was Eleanor of Foix. And she asked him to send her some of his correspondence with others as a form of entertainment for her. Okay? So we know by this that he was a famous correspondent and that he wrote about entertaining subjects, and other people wanted to read about those things. Okay? So the result was, it's not really a book per se, it's like a folder, a collection of these letters of correspondence that dates between about 1455 and 65. There's a copy of it, there's only one copy extant in the National Library in Madrid. There certainly would have been others, they're gone. Right? It consists of about 200 pages, 160 pages of which are the letters and the answers. 20 letters, 20 answers, 160 pages, okay? And 40 of the rest of the book, or 40 pages, were his poetry. Okay? And news of his gathering activity got around well before the Countess of Foix ever got her copy. People were concerned about what letters they wrote that might end up there. One unnamed lady, he never mentioned ladies' names, okay? She wrote to Don Fernando that concerned not about her identity, but that letters might reveal her intellectual simplicity or her inadequate writing style. When he included these letters, men's names were revealed and women's names were never revealed as a matter of courtesy. A number of these letters were initiated by women. They wrote to Don Fernando for advice, intellectual advice. They asked him about books that they had read and that they didn't quite understand. They asked him about moral dilemmas. They talked about the education of women, what books women might read. They had debates about philosophical issues. So that's why these letters took so long to write. Okay. Some wrote about more practical matters. Okay? In one case, a woman asked him to reply to a love letter that she received from another man. But another woman wrote that she really enjoyed reading the love letters he wrote to the woman he loved. Okay? Sounds a bit outrageous. Sounds like what my students might call so the wrong thing to do. Okay? But this is something that was done. Okay? What makes the story sort of juicier is the fact that she broke off their love affair and then went into a convent. She went into a convent at Las Huelgas, Spain. It's a convent that was founded for royal and aristocratic women. Now, she didn't break off and then join the convent out of sort of broken heart, but it's probably where her family had destined her to go a long time ago. Okay? And so she broke off the relationship, and he continued to write to her, asking her to please take him back, that just because she was a nun, that was no reason to end the relationship, which back then was right. Have things changed very much? Think about it. Okay. He wrote about projecting jealousy about a future lover she might have behind convent walls, etc. Okay. And they talked about previous letters. And he doesn't give up pursuing her. These are letters that's in this book and that other people are reading, right? He was serious about pursuing her. He kept writing her letters. He kept writing her poetry. And in one anguished letter, he wrote, "If you were born so lovely that you cause men everywhere to be desirous of you, how can I be blamed for desiring and wanting to possess what all mankind, if not reason itself, would not deny me?" Okay? Nice. Right? Love letters were a necessary part of love relationships, so much so that there were books written. This is called the Book of Letters and Verses to Inspire New Loves. Okay? Let me see. Yep, I'm done. Okay? It would tell people how to start love affairs, how to end love affairs, how to send gifts. Okay? So what do we come away with? Okay, what has really changed? I don't think a lot has changed. Because what these letters show us is that even then, even in the 15th century, as today, people are working or communicating in networks of friends, okay, where they are sharing information. Now we do it via Facebook or Twitter. We're sharing information that some people complain about and some people don't. Okay? So perhaps the materials have changed and the length of things have changed, but I don't think that let's say, the acceptable boundaries of our behavior has changed very much since the 15th century. That's all the time they give me. Thanks. No, it's not you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Marino. And there'll be an opportunity when everyone kind of cross-talks to bring out some other points. Now we're going to have Dr. Saleem Alhabash, who's an assistant professor of public relations and social media, jointly appointed in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, along with the Department of Telecommunications, Information Studies, and Media. Dr. Alhabash's research is geared towards understanding how new communication technologies can be utilized in cross-cultural and international communication, and he has an emphasis on changing attitudes and stereotypes of foreign nations.
It's a nice segue because Dr. Nancy talked about letters and communication in the 15th century, and I'm going to transition to the current time in talking about how the internet has changed how we define relationships, how do we define friendship, and who is our friend now? You know, so traditionally speaking, when we talk about communication, I'm sure you're all familiar with this model, right? You all can identify that this linear model is about a sender sending a message via a certain medium, be it audiovisual, print, such as a letter, audio only, or even face-to-face to a receiver. And this is how we understood communication as it was for the past centuries. This is the model that we have gone through. I think this is how the model looks like at the moment with social media. This exponential growth in the number of social media, growth in the number of users of social media, and the number of social media that caters to different interests and different needs is amazing. But why should we care about it, right? So one way to look at why should we care about it is to look at the numbers. There's over 1 billion Facebook users. So if Facebook were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world, right after China and India. Quite interesting. Over 500 million Twitter users. Over 800 million unique visitors to YouTube, and over 72 hours of content uploaded. Yeah, that's every minute to YouTube. So can you imagine how many hours of content have been uploaded since I started speaking or since this session started? But the most important thing is that in the past, social exchange, how we performed communication, had clear messages and clear outcomes. I talk to someone about something and I get the feedback, and this is how we communicated. In today's world, the messages are so abundant and the outcomes of communication are ambiguous. I mean, how many of you are overwhelmed with the amount of information that is on Facebook or online? You know, just doing a simple Google search will result in millions and millions of pages that deal specifically with the topic you're interested in. So, in the current era that we live in, relationships are about online engagement, how we engage with one another, at least that's how I'm arguing, how we interact with one another on different media, and the behavior, the practice of these relationships have moved from face-to-face or letter writing into clicks, right? How many likes do I have on my Facebook status updates? How many times do I press the refresh button to check how many people liked my post? And the boundaries of friendship have moved from the offline world to reflect the online world. In who do I include in my network? Which status update do I like? Which link do I share on Facebook or Twitter or Tumblr? And who comments and how do I comment on different things online? So what I'm going to talk about today are two things. I'm going to talk about cyberbullying and online dating, and I promise you that it will make sense. There is a connection by the end of this talk. The reason why I want to talk about cyberbullying is because it's a very important issue, and very briefly defined as any type of harassment or harm that is carried out through the use of technology, sending someone harmful messages, writing something nasty about someone. So we all know what cyberbullying is. But it's very different from traditional bullying. So traditional bullying was at the school for a period of 8 hours, and then people went home and everything was okay. Cyberbullying happens all the time, everywhere, and people can be anonymous when they carry it out. So in talking about bullying and cyberbullying, a recent study by the US Government Accountability Office showed that 28% of teenagers in school have reported that they have been bullied, and only 6% have reported that they've been cyberbullied. Now, this study is problematic because they have not clearly defined what was cyberbullying, or the definition was rather very narrow. If we look at other studies, such as the Pew Internet and American Life Project, we can see that 20% of teenagers who use social media have reported that their peers have been mean to them online. Even more alarming, 88% have reported that they have seen someone being cruel or rude or mean to others online. What's even more alarming is that 90%, the one before the last, 90% of the sample ignored the bullying online. They didn't do anything about it. So what we can see is that most of the research on cyberbullying has focused on pre-adult populations, on children and teenagers, thinking that once people step into college, bullying stops, cyberbullying stops, everyone starts singing Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya. And the most common strategy is that the best thing to do is to ignore the bully, just move away. And even though the percentages are low, but the effects are really dire. A couple of years ago, there was an instance where a young woman in Missouri committed suicide after a mother posed as a teenage young man and told her to go commit suicide in order to prove her love to this fictitious young man. So it's a pretty serious issue, and we can still see it on our campuses. And I'll get to that in a little while. And most of cyberbullying happens on social media sites. So instead of talking about social media sites as the problem, the work that I'm doing is trying to figure out how can social media be the solution? How can we solve this problem? So what I do experiments, and I expose people to hypothetical situations. So what you're seeing here is one of the messages that experimental participants see. So we varied the emotional tone of these messages. We exposed them to either positive, negative, or coactive. And coactive messages here include both positive and negative emotions. And what's interesting about this study is we varied the number of likes and shares. I don't know if you can see that, but as I flip, keep your eyes fixated on the number of likes and shares, and you can see that it's the same messages. We just varied the number of likes and shares. And we wanted to see whether this would do anything, would have any effect in terms of the receptiveness of participants to these messages. So we conducted an online experiment with about 365 MSU students, average age of 21 years old, mostly female, mostly freshman and sophomore, and mostly white. And we found out that they are heavy users of Facebook. 95.3% of them have Facebook accounts. They have, on average, they have about 670 friends, and they spend close to 2 hours on average on Facebook every single day. Contrary to the myth that bullying stops when people go into college, 22.5% of the sample reported that they've been bullied in the past few months. 17.8%, they've been cyberbullied. 10% admitted that they have cyberbullied others. And even more alarming, everyone can see it, about 70% saw others being cyberbullied. So it's a very serious case, and it mostly happens on social network sites and by text messaging. So now I just want to highlight a few of the results for the experiment. We found out that positive messages were most effective in terms of influencing people's attitudes toward the messages, toward the issue of cyberbullying, and also prompted people to share these messages online, to like them, to comment on them, what we're calling viral behavioral intention. So positive is good. If you want people to like what you post on Facebook, then make it positive. No one likes Debbie Downers. Also, what was even more interesting is that messages that had low likes and low shares, we didn't expect that, were the most favored. And the explanation for that is because people want to be original, they want to be opinion leader, they like the things. You know, how many times have you been like, why are old people sharing the, It's Friday song on Facebook? And other interesting thing is we found contrast between the different types of behaviors. We often think that behaviors online are just one big thing, but we found that it's much easier to like something than to share it, than to comment on it. And this is important because these online behaviors are a reflection of how much cognitive effort do we want to put into an indicator of our engagement with these messages. So, we're talking about online behaviors here, and it's beyond, okay, so I have 2 minutes, so I'll try to wrap up very quickly. So I'll move on this side, and I just want to talk about that we also use the internet to express who we are. We all want to feel liked, loved, and be popular. And I just briefly want to talk about online dating because, Match.com promotes that 1 in 5 relationships have started online. So what we did is, I'll just run through these. These are just word clouds of the most, about 50,000 profiles on OkCupid. And as you can see, you can predict that the person who is right, these words are for an African American male, whereas these are for a white female, white male, and African American female. So we figured out that people carry through their culture as they're communicating about themselves online. And so what we have done is we constructed fake profiles that were completely anonymous in terms of there are no pictures, there are no names on there, and half of the profiles had black attributes in them, and the other half had white stereotypes in them. And our results show that without any identifying information, white stereotypic profiles were rated as more attractive than black stereotypic profiles, and these are just the results for white female, mostly white females here. And then we we put images on these profiles. So we had both stereotype congruent and stereotype incongruent. So it could be an African American male with a black sounding profile, and the same with white and white, and the opposite. So an African American male with white stereotypic attributes and a white male with black stereotypic attributes. And we found out that whites were rated as more attractive, and people expressed greater behavioral intentions toward whites. And the same, I'll just run through this. And also when white profiles were stereotypic, meaning reflecting white attributes, they were rated as more attractive and had greater behavioral intentions to them. But I'll run through this. So what I really wanted to make today is that relationships are changing, the internet is changing the meaning of social exchanges and interactions. And we do bring all our perceptions and values to the online world. The technological revolution might have changed the world, but not people. And the internet is a reflection of who we are, whether it's for the better or worse. So I'll end it right there. There's a brief acknowledgement for my co-author, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Alhabash. And now we're going to have Dr. Jennifer Watling Neal, an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. Dr. Neal's research program addresses the influences of peer and teacher social networks on childhood outcomes and intervention dissemination. Her research focuses broadly on face-to-face relationships in an educational context.
Everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Good. This is kind of nice. I actually like going kind of towards the end. I think, so Nancy was talking about letter writing, and Saleem was talking about the internet. I'm kind of in the middle. I do face-to-face relationships. So just a little about me. I was trained as a community psychologist at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Community psychology is sort of a very small subfield. How many people have ever heard of community psychology here? A few of you. Michigan State does have a good community psych program, hence why I'm here. But it's a pretty small subfield, really focused on social problems and trying to solve social problems. I've been an assistant professor here in the psychology department since 2009. And really, I was trained in community psychology, but my work is fairly interdisciplinary. So I also pull in a lot of sociological work into my research, and developmental psychology as well. So you're going to see a little bit of a blend today of those three things. And my broad research focus is on face-to-face relationships in educational contexts. So in classrooms, in schools, and in districts. I typically work at the elementary school level. I also use social networks in my research a lot. So when you hear the term social networks, what do you guys typically think of? Anybody want to throw something out? People oftentimes will say Facebook, right, internet, so a lot of the things that Saleem was talking about. When I'm referring to social networks, I'm referring to it in a much broader sense. So I'm referring to a research paradigm. And a research paradigm is really both theory and method that gives us sort of a place to focus our research questions. And social network analysis really focuses on understanding patterns of relationships in the world. And there are two key components to any social network. You have the nodes. These are the actors in your network. Typically, we would think of these as individual people, but there are network analysts out there who look at nodes that are organizations or look at nodes that are cities or communities, for example. And we also have relationships in the network. And so typically with individuals, you might have things like friendships. You might have things like advice relationships. With organizations, it might be things like referrals between organizations, right? And so there's two components to network analysis. And literally what network analysts typically do is they really do kind of map out relationships between a set of nodes. So in the case of the work that I do, I actually do kind of map the boundaries of friendships. So it's a nice title for this symposium. And I really have two kind of broad research areas. My first research area really focuses on how kids' classroom relationships are associated with their behaviors, both pro-social and kind of bullying, aggressive behaviors, like Saleem was talking about. My other area of research really focuses on how teachers' advice relationships are associated with their use of classroom practices, new innovative classroom practices. Today, given the amount of time that we have, I'm only going to focus on this top question, which I think fits kind of nicely with some of the things that Saleem was talking about earlier. And I'm going to focus today on a study that I did where I was really interested in how the structure of kids' classroom relationships affected their relationally aggressive behaviors. So what exactly is relational aggression? So I have a cartoon here that sort of illustrates relational aggression. It's kind of the time of year for Charlie Brown. We see him on TV a lot during this time of year. We have Charlie Brown here interacting with two of the lesser-known Peanut characters, Violet and Patty. And Violet and Patty say, "Can you come to our party on Monday, Charlie Brown?" Charlie Brown says, "Monday? Sure, I can be there on Monday." And the girls say, "Well, how about if we had it on Tuesday?" And he said, "Well, no, I can't really be there if we had it on Tuesday." And the girls say, "Well, that settles it then. We're having our party on Tuesday." How many people have experienced this? Either as a victim or an aggressor. Right? This is a pretty common occurrence. These are behaviors that are really designed to harm others through the manipulation of social relationships. And typical examples might include spreading a rumor, or in this case, social exclusion, as we see this happening to Charlie Brown. Some of the cyberbullying things that Saleem was talking about earlier could actually also fit in this relational aggression context. So I wanted to study this, and I collected some data in an elementary school. This was a kindergarten through 8th grade elementary school in an urban area. And it was a small school, so it only had one classroom per grade, which allowed me to really easily map the relationships between all the kids in a particular grade. I collected data on all of the 3rd through 8th grade kids in that school. It's 144 students. And just a little bit of background on the demographics. This was a low-income population. 79.9% received free or reduced price lunch. You can also see this is a really diverse school. So we had no clear sort of majority in terms of race, ethnicity. We had about 30% white, 26% Latino, and 34% African American kids on the sample. So in looking at relational aggression, a lot of the past research has focused on who relational aggressors are. So a lot of the past research was really interested in gender and in looking at whether girls or boys are more likely to engage in these behaviors. So we all know that the stereotypes, right? We've all seen Mean Girls, right? This idea that girls tend to kind of engage in these relationally aggressive behaviors is sort of a part of popular culture. But when you actually look at the literature, the findings are very mixed. There's not a whole lot of evidence that girls are more likely to engage in these behaviors than boys. And in fact, we see a lot of evidence that boys are engaging in equal levels of relational aggression. So there's sort of mixed findings out there. The other thing that people have focused on is sort of age group. And we know early adolescence is a pretty terrible time. Everybody remembers junior high, right? We typically see these behaviors, at least if you're looking across elementary school through high school, really peaking in the early adolescent period. So this is kind of interesting, but also a little boring in the sense that it can tell you maybe who to target if you want to prevent these behaviors or reduce these behaviors, but it doesn't give you a whole lot of information about what to do. So in my work, I really wanted to focus on where relational aggressors are in the classroom peer network. To understand, are there elements of the friendship structure that are kind of facilitating kids' opportunities to manipulate social relationships? And I'm going to tell you about one aspect of this position of the network, which is, are kids' friends also friends with one another? So I was looking specifically at this. This is what's known as density. And it's pretty easy to measure. Basically, with any grade, we can kind of map out the relationships that kids have with one another. then we can look to see, are their friendships sort of low density or are they high density? So in the first graph you see there, we've got a low density case. So if you imagine the big green dot in the middle is our focal child of interest, right? And they have 5 friends. None of those friends are friends with one another. This would be the lowest possible density that you could have. It'd be a density score of 0. It means that that kid is kind of serving as a liaison between disconnected kids, right? High density, on the other hand, is a case where all of your friends are also friends with one another, right? This is the case that we have in the other graph here. And this is a case where basically you've got this sort of tightly knit clique of friends around you. So thinking about the literature, we know that high density should promote intimacy in relationships. And in particular, if you have high density relationships, that should sort of facilitate close contact. It should facilitate things like sharing, and potentially could increase relationally aggressive behaviors because more people are sharing sort of sensitive information. We also know that high density networks are sort of desirable for kids. Kids really want to be part of cliques, especially as they move into early adolescence. So there's a possibility that these high-density networks could encourage relational aggression. In particular, once kids get into these kind of clique-like positions, they may engage in relational aggression to maintain their social status in those cliques. So just to give you a little bit of information about what we found. So here is one particular classroom in that study. The dots, again, represent individual kids in this classroom, and the lines between the dots represent hanging out relationships between kids. In this graph, who do you think is likely to be relationally aggressive? Guesses? So I'm going to show you here the most relationally aggressive kid and the least relationally aggressive kid in this network. And what we see, the most relationally aggressive kid is the dark green dot. What we notice about this kid's network is that they're connected to 2 other kids who are also connected, right? So what we have here is a maximally dense network. This child has a network density of 1. It also has a very high level of teacher-reported relational aggression, highest in the classroom. The least relationally aggressive kid, on the other hand, their network structure looks really different, right? They are in a position where they are sort of bridging between different groups. And basically, this is a person that isn't engaging in a whole lot of teacher-reported relational aggression. So we do see some evidence that tightly knit cliques may have a dark side, that being part of a high-density network may sort of facilitate or encourage relationally aggressive behaviors. So I only have a couple minutes left, but before I end, I just want to give sort of a take-home message here. Beyond who kids are, relational aggression is associated with where they are in the social network. Now this was a cross-sectional study, so of course we can't determine causality here. It could be, perhaps, that the relational aggression leads to changes in the network. So future studies would need to kind of pair that out. But if we can show that your position in the network sort of facilitates or constrains these behaviors, what it means is that we can establish network-based interventions. And we can really look at interventions to prevent relational aggression that focus on relationships. And these could be fairly easy things, right? The idea here is we don't want kids to kind of get situated in these really tightly knit groups. So what teachers could do is periodically change seating charts, right? Or change work groups out so that kids are interacting with more different people in the classroom. And of course, also avoiding sort of the modular seating charts where you're seated at a table where you might sort of establish friendships in a small set group, right? So it could be relatively easy things that you could try to create less dense networks. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Dr. Neal. And for our final presentation tonight, before we open it up for a little bit of crosstalk and questions, we have Dr. Raymond Brock. He is a University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. He is an experimental particle physicist, and the author or co-author of more than 300 publications in experimental and theoretical particle physics. He has served as the chair of the Department of Physics and Astronomy and was instrumental in the conception, design, and building of the Biological and Physical Sciences building here on campus, as well as the SOAR telescope in Chile. And after Dr. Brock, we'll tie it all together, and if you aren't yet seeing connections, they will become clearer.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I can hear me. So now for something completely different. I'm going to talk about schizophrenia in a way that will become apparent to you as I go along. I'm not going to talk about particle physics so much. If you want to learn about particle physics, take my ISP course. I'm going to talk about how I look at the collaborations that I've worked in and the ones that I work in today, and you'll see that my frustrations are going to show. I'm a high-energy physicist, which is another name for particle physics. I prefer particle physics, but our funding agencies dub us high-energy physicists, and so that's how we often call ourselves. If you'll find us as the high-energy physics group at Michigan State. I've been here for 30 years this year, and as was just mentioned, I served as chair of the department for almost 150 years, it seemed, and I stepped down and went back to being a part of the problem rather than being constantly a part of the solution. But, you know, it's a living. Now, a high-energy physicist does not deal in energy in the sense that you think of, and it's certainly not personal energy anymore. What high-energy physicists do is make use of the famous T-shirt equation to take objects that are very small, accelerate them to very high energies, and then with the identical relationship between energy and mass, one's able to produce states of matter which are both fundamental and much more massive than anything that might exist stably in our universe now. In essence, in fact, we're probing right now about a picosecond after the Big Bang, the conditions that existed at that time. Right now I work at the Large Hadron Collider, which is a proton accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland. I, with 3,000 of my closest friends, have been doing experiments there now for about 2 years after 15 years of building the device you're about to see. The accelerator is 300 feet underground. The detector that we've constructed is quite large. It produces enormous amounts of data, so we're networked in an electrical way. We built the entire detector. That's just a cartoon to show you what the inside is like. And EU-sized people don't walk around on the inside of that device. But it's a big thing, and it needs to be a big thing in order to be able to collect the amounts of data that we need to collect. It takes, indeed, all those people to build a device like that, to keep it running for decades, because this device will run for decades. I said we're in the second year of running. We'll run for 2 more decades. And to analyze the data that come out. The amounts of data that come out of this thing is scary. There's no single place on Earth that's large enough to do the data reduction. There are about 1 billion events per second produced in our detector, and we build electronics in order to reduce that to something that's actually manageable. But it still requires 10 nations around the world to do the frontline data analysis. And so we live in data grids. But the thing that we have not yet figured out how to grid is people. And that 3,000 people thing is a much harder problem than spending 15 years building a device and 20 years making it run and trying to understand how the Big Bang came about. This is a picture of Geneva. That's Lake Geneva in the background, Mont Blanc in the horizon looking south to the Swiss Alps. The circle on the ground there is not a real circle on the ground. It's just showing you where the Large Hadron Collider ring is underground. The city is at the tip of the lake, and over on sort of the at 2 o'clock on the ring, that little circle there is the laboratory campus, and it's beneath that spot that the little video showed you where our detector lives. There are, like I said, 3,000 physicists on this experiment. That's 3,000 PhDs as well as graduate students, or hundreds of graduate students, from 170 universities and laboratories from around the world in 38 countries. In the United States, there are about 700 of us, and we work out of 40 universities and 4 national laboratories. And so this is a whole big mess of people. There's a Brand X experiment, our competition across the ring 17 miles away from the cafeteria, which is their problem, not mine. They are similarly large, their detector is similarly capable, and they too work in all those countries and are stationed heavily in the United States. The United States is a big player, obviously, in these experiments, but the United States is not a so-called member state of the CERN laboratory. We have a special position that's a little tenuous right now, actually. So, great big experiments. We like to say that the sun never sets on our collaboration, which is called ATLAS. That's a small meeting of the group of us in the building that's dedicated to the experiment. Up there in the middle on the left next to the orange block, you can see the Michigan State Spartan flag hanging over the edge, because we had about a half a dozen of us there during that particular meeting. This is the author list of the Higgs boson discovery paper that was published at the end of July. It's a little difficult to figure out who did what in that publication list, and so my field right off the bat has a difficulty in explaining itself to other people and other disciplines. We don't, of course, publish the author list. We're simply listed in the paper as the ATLAS collaboration, and then you can go click something and find out who the names are of all the people that work there. This is the Michigan State group. We're a large group. We've been supported by the National Science Foundation for the 30 years that I've been here, and will continue to be, I hope. The underlined people on there are people that all work at the LHC. The double asterisks are people who live in Switzerland, where they live in France. The laboratory is actually, it straddles the border between Switzerland and France, and so we've got as many people living in France as we do in Switzerland. But the point is, we've got half a dozen people who are not where we are, and right off the bat, that's a problem. We've got a lot of graduate students that work on this experiment, and some of them travel a lot. Some of them are married, have families, and that's a little more difficult, and some of them were able to station in Europe for months at a time. So it's a like I said, a big mess. We've got to talk. I mean, we've got to work, and we got to work daily across all these time zones, and that's a real mess. My Japanese colleagues are shadows of their former selves because they're never in sync. When I go to the lab, I'm working during the day, of course, but then in the evening, I got stuff to do back here. And so I have to keep working here, and so I'm on the phone and on video conferencing when I'm there, and when I'm here, I'm on the phone and video conferencing when I'm there, with folks there. But the Japanese, man, and the Koreans, they're just completely out of sync all the time, and they're going to die at young ages. So tools are a real problem for us. Of course, we use Skype all the time. We have 3 different brands of video conferencing, great big Polycom systems, 2 of them in our department, 1 of them in our office at CERN. I use the phone, which is crazy, more than probably any other device. And of course, I'm in the air all the time. And like I said, the time zone inconvenience is a real problem. I get up in the morning and it's right after lunch. I got to get on the phone from my house right before breakfast. I got to find out what disasters happened overnight for me, which was during the morning for them. So these are really weird complications that I hadn't thought about before we got ourselves involved in this. And I sort of wonder how we're going to get through the next 20 years this way. And the thing that's strange is it's our field that invented the web. Our experiments have always been big. And so Tim Berners-Lee, a CERN employee, at the end of the 1980s and the very early 1990s, constructed and built the hypertext language and the first web page that was used specifically so that high-energy physicists could communicate with one another across time zones and across many national boundaries. And so I've been using the web since before you even knew there was a web, because it was just a part of our field. That's a picture of the first web server, which was an old Next computer. So we like to think that we're cutting edge. You know, we're hot shots. We're big shots in computing and big shots in electronics and big shots in detector design, but not so much. Think about this. If you created a calendar app and you got a 10% market share, you'd be rich for the rest of your life. But suppose you've got to collaborate among hundreds of people and you create a collaborative application that's 90% adopted. You're in despair all the time. It's a complete failure. We're still using text-based email to communicate. This is an email message that was a review, an internal review of a publication. And in this experiment, we've already published 300 papers. And so there's a constant stream of publication going on. And what you can see in there is some poor slob is typing line 51, should have been this, you know, line 50. It's absolutely insane for us to be so sophisticated in some ways and unable to gridify people in another way. We never left text-based email, even after being so sophisticated in so many other ways. That's the schizophrenic part that I'm concerned about. Yeah, Facebook, I love Facebook. I use Facebook all the time. It's interesting to me that people either really love Facebook or people really hate Facebook. There's like nobody who's like ambivalent about Facebook, right? But for those that love it and are on it, I use it in my classes. I have about 150 collaborators who I friend, and we constantly chat in Facebook about work as well as about personal stuff. In fact, to me, Facebook takes the place of being able to walk down the hall and have coffee with a colleague. You know, I know about their kids, you know, I know about what they did last night, as well as work problems. And so I like Facebook because I think it personalizes relationships, the opposite of what you tend to think of as the critique of Facebook. So in some ways, my kids and I and my wife were much more sophisticated communicators than this hotshot research field that I spend my days working on. So I find it really complicated to be on both the leading and the dull edge of so many parts of my life. And I think about the letter writing that was talked about earlier. That's a system that works and was sophisticated for the day and up to date for the day. My system is not that way. We're still doing 1978 communication in my field. So now I've exposed my frustration to you.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. Before I go on, can we just take a moment and thank all of the panelists for their presentations? So I actually have the benefit, I'll let you in on a little secret. I have the benefit along with, I just totally lost your name as I'm looking at you. John Beck. He's my good friend, and I just totally lost his name. I have the pleasure of, with John Beck, sitting in on a preliminary conversation with all of the panelists, and in those conversations, we get to hear and see the connections emerge. And so I'm going to share some of what came out of those conversations and use that to maybe prime the panelists to talk about some of the other things that we saw as connections, and then use that as a jumping off point to open up to you. One of the connections that we saw across the four discussions was different conceptions of culture. And what does culture really mean? And the idea that it really is contextual. And really being able to pay attention to that, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, or profession, and the idea that we really need to understand what is the culture that we're operating in. And things such as etiquette. how do we interact and understand the nature of our interactions? The idea that there's a like. So what we haven't heard from Dr. Marino yet, and I'm sure she'll share, is that when Don was being asked to prepare the letters, literally he had to rewrite them, but he's sharing the letters. So every time someone says, may I have that letter, it's the common day version of liking. And so this idea of, there's something out there, I want to see it, I want to enjoy it and be a part of it, and then I want to share it. Also this idea of advice. And so we had Dr. Neal talking about, if we can map the networks, if we can understand the nature of the relationships, we can begin to give advice to one another. Well, the letters were used as a way of giving advice. We also have the idea of class and the fact that there's costs associated with everything we do. And so when you go back to the original letter writing, that really limited communication and relationship exchanges to within a certain class. And then the cross-class happened in terms of sharing information, but we didn't share what we were talking about. Right? And so as we've emerged over time and had technology change, we begin to lose some of the barriers tied to class. However, Dr. Alhabash says, well, maybe yes, maybe no, because what we carry with us perceptually still plays out because we have these stereotypes. And even if we're color, gender, everything else blind, we still associate certain characteristics with certain types of people. And when we see those in writing, we begin to act a certain way. And so the nature of the relationships we have in person, we still have them online. And so how do we get past that? And then we have this idea that we say we're global, right? And we're doing all of this amazing research, and we have to talk with all of these people in different places. And how do we make that happen? How do we make technology work for us in such a way that we really can have real-time relationships? We really can make things happen, and at the same time not throw out what works. And so when we had the example from physics of all of these people in a professional relationship and trying to figure out how to make things work, and all of the existing technology doesn't make it happen. And so even with our advances, we're still back at step one. And so those were some of the things that came about is, how do we change the nature of our interactions? How do we engage more meaningfully? And how do we use social media, which really could help us bridge some of the gulfs, to take that next step? And how do we remove some of our inherent isms and phobias from our interactions to change the nature of our relationships? And so I'm going to ask the panelists to think about, that earlier discussion, think about what you've heard today, and maybe offer some insights or questions to each other based on that.
Well, I guess I can talk a little bit about the isms. Unfortunately, our friends in psychology show that it's really hard to change the bias against outgroup members. At an implicit level, we all categorize people as people who are like us and people who are not like us, whether it's based on race, it's based on gender, it's based on nationality. But one of the slides that I went through because I was running out of time is, we know why this happens and what are the differences. So I think, unfortunately, the online world, there's a very famous philosopher who tried to think about technology early on, 50 or 60 years ago. His name is Marshall McLuhan. Is anyone familiar with him? So he's the one who said the medium is the message, but also this was his most famous quote. But he also predicted that technology will make our world closer, will eliminate boundaries and barriers, and we become this global village. And unfortunately, we don't. Online within the United States or within different countries, we remain in these silos that we have built in the outside world. We can see that different ethnicities use Facebook differently than others. But on a happy note, I think there's more opportunity to go beyond the fear of being within a group where you're the minority. So, I mean, we tend to always favor being with the in-group, being with people who are like us. I mean, good example of that is I'm conservative, so I tend to go to websites that mirror my values. You know, I tend to go to Fox News all the time, but maybe on the online I can slip a little bit of CNN or MSNBC over there. So there is that opportunity that if you are in a social network where you have these nodes that were talked about with others who are different from you, then you have better exposure. Maybe a little bit of exposure, not to change these implicit attitudes and stereotypes, but to realize that you are making an error in judgment when you're evaluating and enforcing control mechanisms on the expression of prejudice and all of these different isms.
Social network analysts call what Saleem was talking about homophily, which is the idea that birds of a feather tend to flock together. And we do see along lots of different socio-demographic characteristics that people tend to have a preference for similar others. But I think what's interesting about the internet is in face-to-face interactions, we're oftentimes constrained by our opportunities. So a lot of times, we tend to end up kind of sorted in situations where we don't have a lot of opportunities to interact with different people. And the internet, I do think, opens that up in a way that we may not have in face-to-face relations. So I think there is some promise there for interactions across groups.
Well, homophily, I mean, my groups, that's what they're all about, right? I mean, they know no other worlds. They communicate between kingdoms. Spain is not a country, but a collection of kingdoms at that point. And most people don't have access to reading and writing. There is a growing bourgeoisie in Spain in the 15th century, and people who work in cities and start to work in publishing and artisans and things like that. But the groups that are most documented are the groups that we've seen here, those people who are aristocrats or nobles and who court historians write about. There are no histories written of common people except much later by people like us. And so these letters are sort of a little bit of micro-history, events and relationships that we would have no idea about if it weren't for these letters left behind. But they are very homogeneous groups, and that's just the way it operated.
So Chip, Dr. Brock. Based on your experiences with the large research group, what would you suggest to others about how we manage relationships in general? And when we're talking about, say, a college campus and we're trying to bring together diverse populations to make things happen, or other research groups, do you have insights on that?
Well, the short answer is no, because I'm constantly mystified that we're able to do the things that we do, because there's no formal accountability in typically in experiments. There's no bosses. There are elected leaders, but then there's just sort of the peer pressure and the constant terror that you live with of screwing up and messing up your colleagues' plans. And so I truly don't understand how these things work. I've worked in two very large collaborations, hundreds of people in one and thousands in this one, and we build things that work, and somehow it happens. Now it's daunting for graduate students, as you can imagine, that join these things. There's a constant of nature that has sort of persisted, and that constant is 10. That is to say, stuff doesn't get done in groups that are much bigger than about 10. And so in a collaboration of 3,000 people, it's lots and lots of groups of 10. And really much more than that, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And much fewer than that, at least in our business, there's not enough to do the work. And so it just kind of naturally kind of coalesces into groups that are about the size of 10. But always mystified. None of us went to graduate school to learn how to manage budgets. None of us went to graduate school to learn how to manage hundreds of people or to intuit how different nationalities are going to work together or how different funding agencies are going to work together. Somehow it miraculously occurs. I'm going to go to my grave being mystified by it.
Would this be a fair edit? Because even though you said no, I actually heard that there are manageable sized groups, right? So you have to find the natural size of the group that's going to work together. And you have to let that energy emerge. You have to respect what different people are bringing to the game. You have to have a healthy fear that my activities affect somebody else. So this consciousness that there are others out there that while I'm doing what I'm doing, I need to be paying attention that it affects others. And so I think that actually does give us some information about how we interact as a society, as a campus, that we're not in it alone. And we have to be willing to make some mistakes and then go back and catch up and fix things quickly. That the mistakes are going to be costly if we just go oops and move on. But the trick is to figure out how to bring them together. Would that be fair?
Yeah, boy, I'm smarter than I thought I was. Is 10 the right number for 7-year-olds?
It might be. I mean, I do think having small groups, though, is exactly what allows your groups to enforce norms. Because they're small enough where you guys can kind of have sanctions if somebody doesn't do their work. If it got much larger, it'd be very difficult.
Yeah, that's right. You have to kind of watch for that.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to ask questions. And you don't have to feel confined to the subjects we brought up as long as you keep it in the realm of relationships and tools and nature relationships. And we'll just kind of let the panelists answer as they see fit. And Joyce or John will be going around with a microphone because we want to make sure that we capture all of this.
Okay, I'm coming this way. This is my exercise program, as my wife will tell you all.
Hi there. Thank you all for your presentations. One kind of thing I noticed in all of the things you were talking about was that a lot of these things, these interactions among people, are among people who are on sort of an equal status plane. Like it's aristocrats talking with aristocrats. It's people on Facebook. It's, all students together. It's physicists all working together. And it's kind of like there's no sort of formal hierarchy established in this. And do you feel that, some of the challenges we face in relationships is because there's not, where your collaboration is difficult, you have to break up into groups of 10 because there's no boss and there's no chain of order and leadership that kind of does this in a formal way? Do you think that kind of has an impact on relationships?
Yeah, it might. Like I said, I'm mystified by it, so I've not much to say that's particularly enlightening. And I don't know if 10 is the number, that would be the same for other fields. It might very well be context dependent. But you're certainly right. I think it's an interesting observation that you made that the communication is horizontal in all the cases that we talked about, and maybe even too horizontal in my case.
And I think it largely depends on different personalities. So there are certain personality types that work better if there is a clear hierarchy and structure, whereas others are much more comfortable in collaborative group settings. And this is something, one of the things that I do in my research is try to find out how do messages get viral. And we're starting to find that there are differences in who can conform to the need to pass along the message and who cannot. So often we tend to think of people as the same, whereas in order to be effective, you really have to understand not only the dynamics of the relationships, but who are you dealing with and who are the users and how they're different. And that's one of the common myths about Facebook is we tend to think that, or any social media, or video games, we tend to link it to a stereotype of a certain age group or a certain gender. And it's not. The fastest growing age group on Facebook is 55-year-olds and above. On video games, the mean age of video gamers is 35 years old. not teens and tweens, although 97% of them teens report playing video games. So in most of the studies, especially in experimental studies, we try to recruit as homogeneous groups to show these effects, but there is a need to do it across different groups, I think. That's a great point.
Have you studied the frequency of Facebook friends who deal mostly with others? I mean, how big are the groups? How big, if you were to draw a network?
So I've been actually studying Facebook since 2007. That's the first, and it was interesting because every year I tend to do a survey about Facebook use, and it's changing. The networks are growing larger and larger. Now, the range that I'm having nowadays is between 10 to 5,000 friends. There are people who have 5,000 friends. I don't know how that is possible.
I didn't mean who clicked on like or friend, but in a day or in a week, how many are the same people does one person tend to deal with?
That I have not studied, but that's a great...
10. I predict it's 10.
Well, maybe it's 6 with the 6 degrees of separation, you know.
So this is an example of how this starts the conversation and we continue it later.
From an interdisciplinary standpoint, it strikes me that there's a huge amount of research on team building in the military and athletic teams and business. And when you talk about cliques and when you talk about homophily and when you talk about bullying, is there some way to connect all of that research to maybe a prescription for what can be done in elementary schools and junior highs and high schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And you're right to suggest that there is sort of an overlap with the team building literature as well. And there are actually some people who are sort of in the business world and in the network world as well that kind of look at sort of what are the ideal ties for different things like promotion or yeah. And I think my work really is sort of focused on at least with aggressive behaviors, what are sort of the networks that are facilitating and constraining these behaviors? And the idea would then be to create interventions that would sort of target those network structures. So some of the examples that I gave earlier, so density is one thing that we know is sort of at least associated with higher levels of these behaviors. So trying to find ways for relational aggression at least to create less dense networks. Now, dense networks could be good for other outcomes. So, for example, in Chip's case, dense networks are probably a good thing because they allow people to kind of work together in a group and be very productive. So you also have to kind of think about what the outcome is, and different network structures are going to kind of have different impacts on different outcomes.
I'm Ann Austin, faculty member in education, and I wanted to ask about the nature of people coming to know each other personally, at some personal level, knowing about each other, as compared to just connecting with each other or, say, liking something on Facebook. I'm involved also in not a network as large as yours, Dr. Brock, but about a 75-person National Science Foundation network, supported network, all domestic. But one of my observations is that we try to bring this network of people together about once a year to be able to see each other face to face, and that has really enhanced the nature of the working relationships. So I was curious, I'm guessing that perhaps in the school world too, that Dr. Neal was talking about, that perhaps, I'm hypothesizing, that if students know a little bit more about each other personally, perhaps it could lead to sort of less aggressive behavior. I suppose it could go the other way too. And I'm wondering whether in the cyber world, whether if people get beyond just stereotypes, but come to know something about each other personally, whether that takes it to a different type of relationship. So my question really is, to what extent are knowing something about each other personally and beyond stereotypes, to what extent, how does that change the nature of some of these relationships that were being talked about?
Well, it makes a big difference to us. especially since we live so far away from one another, and sometimes you work with people that you've never met in these big collaborations. We're in France, so restaurants and wine, is an important part of that. But that's why I like Facebook, because I know things about colleagues and their families that helps me to understand them, as well as the pressures they're under, as well as just sort of makes a fuller picture of them for me, that makes it easier for me to work with them when I do.
That would be my hypothesis.
Well, it depends. I mean, there was a recent study that was published a couple of months ago, said that people who use Facebook a lot and see people's newsfeed status updates report greater frustration and dislike of people who post a lot. So sometimes you're having the disparity between, and we all have those in our newsfeed, that this is what I'm eating today, this is what my baby pooped, or whatever. And
But you unfriend them. I mean, that's the great thing about Facebook, is you don't have to read those from people that are...
Mm-hmm. But that's the thing, is not a lot of people understand that you can kick people off your news feed or the privacy settings. And I mean, I'm just thinking in cases that we're seeing in terms of cyberbullying, these personal information, unfortunately, they become the center of the aggression that is happening online. I mean, just the case from Missouri a few years ago, these personal information that the young woman liked a guy, and the mother who posed at that guy was using all of that personal information that led to her suicide. So it's a double-edged sword, I think. And this is why digital literacy is important. This is why my future work is focused on how do we educate teenagers and college students on how to, and even, there is bullying all across different ages, but some of it is kind of a taboo to talk about. I mean, we're hearing from different schools around campus where there's more bullying within faculty, or what, not particularly this campus, but all across the United States. So sometimes the personal information becomes a sort of manipulation, I think.
Let me
I
ask
love Facebook, just but there are problems that...
When I'm on my way over to that corner with the microphone, let me ask a question in transit. If you flatten the relationships, that is, if they're all horizontal, does this increase the power of the information that's passed from person to person? That is, expert knowledge becomes unbelievably important. Across all of that class of very, very aristocratic Spaniards, is it the quality of information that someone might bring? On Facebook, is it the quality of the actual post itself and everything else? Is it a new kind of hierarchy which comes from expert knowledge, or the elan that someone brings to their writing, or to something else other than just the fact that traditional hierarchies? Is it a new kind of hierarchy that we're seeing?
I think you're right. In the one of the cases that I mentioned before, when a woman knew that perhaps her letters might be included in these 20 letters and replies, she was concerned that her letters might not be up to intellectual snuff or style snuff. So she was assuming that a certain level of intellectual curiosity or acumen was necessary for her to participate in this particular thing.
I think that's the difference in the online world, is that there could be situations where there's no clear hierarchy that allows, I mean, one of the things that baffles me, why did Gangnam Style become so viral? I mean, what is it about that song, that video clip, that got it within 3 months more than 700 million hits on YouTube? It became the 3rd most watched YouTube video of all time. So I think it's a mixture of, especially in the online world, because of the abundance of information. In order for something to become viral, to become clicked on, it has to elicit a certain emotional response. a certain cognitive connection and engagement, and mostly things that make us happy. I mean, I bet if I say the phrase "Charlie bit me," people here would know what I'm talking about, right? It's that viral YouTube video of two kids just hanging around.
No, but you don't have to tell me.
Well, it's a YouTube video that got viral. It's just two brothers, and the younger one is biting the finger of the other one, and it's hilarious and it's so cute. And this is why it got viral, because it has that cute factor. It elicits a positive emotional response, and also negative things can elicit that, but it's more for positive because of how we are as a species, I think.
We have a question right here.
My name is Ray Bush. I'm a clinical social worker in the area. And it seems to me that you're talking about a multiple set of tools. There is not one personality or one group size that I think these things fit a need or the need of the situation needs to be described and understood. And I also think that there are some skill sets that are more prone to be able to take advantage or to use these kinds of social skills and networks that you're speaking of. Thank you.
Comments from the group on that?
Before everyone else goes, related to that, one of the things that stood out to me when we were talking is kind of back to the etiquette and how that affects the nature of relationships. So if you think about letter writing and even bring it into the 20th century, I know we're in the 21st, but in the 20th century, when we all learned how to write letters and what consisted of a letter. And then you go to email, and you've already stripped a lot of rules and relationships. So when you're talking about horizontal versus vertical, and then you go to texting and tweets, you lose the structure of basic good manners, right? And so even understanding the nature of how I interact with you as another individual and taking the time to greet you, the idea that there's a greeting that matters and drawing you in, that's building a relationship. And so even in the tools we've used, we've lost this nature of how do we build a relationship, and does that matter? You know, it goes back to the question about face-to-face. And we have a lot of movie examples that were true to life where when you were first integrating sports teams, and the idea that when you brought together the difference, whether it was class or race, the idea that once I had to interact with you and learn something about you and had to treat you with respect, then I understood better. And so as we strip out our ways of understanding each other, do we inhibit how we approach our relationships? And so I wonder what the panel thinks about that. And because it goes back to all these different tools, not everybody can interact with these tools. And so are we leaving people behind?
I don't think my aristocrats would know how to tweet. I don't think they could possibly do something like that. You go on at length, and this is what's expected as part of your polite society. So to write something that's less than many pages long would be a foreign concept to them, I think.
We have
Okay. I'm moving again. Here we go.
I'm interested in the boundaries of being overly dependent on either networks or specifically codependence and like the social aggression there. I wonder if you guys have any comments on that.
So what was the question again? Sorry.
Being overly dependent on either networks or individuals and how that can impact your relationships.
So overly dependent on the networks. I think for like social forms of aggression, like relational aggression, it's definitely dependent on the network because part of the definition of relational aggression is that they're ways of harming that involve manipulating social relationships. So in order to be able to do it, you actually kind of have to have a position in the network that would allow you to manipulate social relations. But then I think, Saleem, you might want to speak
Well,
to
I mean,
this as
it's
well.
the same with cyberbullying. It is having a power imbalance. And this can be sort of maintained, this power imbalance, in different ways. So having the size of your social network and the technology and also the ability. I mean, we've seen movie after movie about this. There's a recent movie about cyberbullying specifically, and it is the one of the problems. There are two problems with this issue, is that people do not stand up to the perpetrator. I mean, in 90% of the cases, people ignore it. And also, the other statistic that was there that was very alarming is that in about 6 out of 10 cases, people would join in because they think it's funny, they think it's okay, and they don't realize that this power imbalance, there's a lot of opinion leadership online. So, and this is how things get viral, and this is how aggression also happens online, in the sense that, you know, I'm posting a nasty joke, or one of the things that I'm currently studying is this website called Texts from Last Night. Are you guys familiar with it? And all of the website is about texts that have emerged when people were drunk, when people had sexual experiences of certain level of intensity, and these are posted online. Thank God they're anonymized, but even though this whole boundary between what is appropriate and inappropriate is diminishing, and it is influenced by alcohol consumption, it is influenced, you know, also, so part of the research that I do deals with understanding how cognitive control or executive functioning, this area in the brain, really influences how we regulate our emotions and responses. And this area in the brain is highly influenced by alcohol consumption, which explains a lot of my bad mistakes in the past. But also it depreciates with age. And this is why now we're noticing that the older generation that is becoming on these websites, they're grappling with how do we deal with this. They're posting things that shouldn't have been posted. So this whole idea is that the online world is only a reflection of our socialization offline. But it comes also with the problem that we can be anonymous. If you go on YouTube, on some of the videos that feature a racial issue and read the comments, it's very disturbing. Or Halo, all of the comments that are exchanged on Halo, it's really disturbing. And with this anonymity, when some websites offer anonymity, we tend to let go. We think no one is watching. But is that good? I mean, I don't know.
Before our next question, I have a clarification question. Was part of the nature of that question, even in terms of our in-person reliance on the networks that we're in and being too dependent on a group of people and what that might mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think that partly speaks to a reason why, you know, being part of a high density clique, right, might give people the power to be able to be more relationally aggressive as well. If you're kind of part of that sort of group where everybody is connected to everybody else, you kind of have more of a chance maybe to engage in those behaviors and also potentially be victimized by those behaviors. So yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to go back to the title of this panel, Mapping the Boundaries of Friendship. And I'm curious for any of your thoughts about your own research and what it tells us about how friendship is understood. So I'm thinking about, a few minutes ago we were talking about the fact that, in the past, letters had a salutation. There was certain etiquette around, at least the letters. But at least when I think about friendship, even in my life, not going back to the 15th or 14th century, that, I would think of issues like respect, support, kindness, interest in other people. So I'm curious about, because we're spanning some historical dimensions too, as well as venues in which friendship could occur, whether any of the panelists, your thoughts about whether our conceptions of what friendship really is are changing. And I guess to add to that, just one final comment, the notion of friending somebody when, one can have 1,000 friends or whatever number of friends, it to me at least suggests that the notion of friend is changing from when, a time period when you might have, 4 really close personal friends and maybe 20 other friends or whatever number it might be. So is our notion of even the concept of friendship changing? And if so, do you have observations of, what we even mean by the term friend? And again, going back to the title, Mapping the Boundaries of Friendship.
Thank you. I think this is a great question because it also sheds the light on the benefits of social network sites and social media sites, in the sense that on these sites you have expressions of strong and weak relationships. So there are people who you've met once or you haven't met or you've heard about, and you friend them or you add them on Twitter, and you start developing this relationship with them. And research has been showing, and part of it was spearheaded at MSU, so go green. It has shown that there is a great potential that these weak relationships, in different contexts, can turn into strong relationships. So for example, if I've met someone once and they live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm visiting and I post on my Facebook, I'm visiting Colorado, and the person remembered me and posted, oh, you should visit me, or oh, I need a place to crash. Can I crash on your couch? So there is that element of turning these weak relationships into strong relationships. Also, the other cool thing about the online world is that there is great potential to rally people around causes. So one of the greatest examples in the past couple of months or last year was Coney 2012. Right? This video that got so viral about the atrocities that have been happening in different countries in Africa by Coney and the need to bring Coney to justice. How it got viral, regardless of what happened to the organizer later on. But the power of, if you put the right message out there, people can rally around it. And you do create these moments where globalization is at its peak. On the flip side, on a day-to-day basis, not so much. There's a lot of fighting. The nasty things that were happening on November 6th, oh my God, with the election. People really going head-to-head. So there is the potential that it could break into uncivility, but also the potential that if it's the right thing, if it's the right moment, it can turn into something good. And I'm trying to do that in parts of my research that I didn't get to present today. I feel I was so negative today.
One of the other benefits of weak relationships that you didn't mention is not only can they turn to strong relationships, but if you keep them weak, they also give you access to information that you might not otherwise have had. So there's a lot of evidence out there in the sociological literature that if you have weak relationships, those are the relationships where you might hear about a new job, for example. So that could be another benefit of the Facebook kind of weak relations as well.
Let me raise a question, 2 words. One word is obligation, and the other word is transaction. Because when I think about sometimes the obligations of friendship, the idea of being a writer and hand copying your own letter because someone asked, that's a heavy obligation on you. It's also a heavy transaction. You know, I mean, a lot of the things you're talking about are obligations that people feel, but there also are transaction costs. And maybe what Facebook and some of the social media you're talking about lower the transaction costs. That, I mean, I no longer have to copy a letter. All I have to do is actually copy the email or even cut and paste. I mean, it becomes easier to do. So could you talk a little bit, all of you, or any of you, about obligations of friendship and the whole notion of transaction costs?
Well, I don't think Don Fernando would ever consider not answering that request for a letter. I suppose it's a form of flattery, or it's, you know, it's a like, or having fans in that way. I think he would be flattered, and it would have been a social obligation to do that. And also to get back to the question about nature of friendship, a couple of the letters exchanged in this book of 20 letters and answers is on the nature of friendship and what it means to be a friend, and when friendships turn to love, and what the difference between love and friendship is. So it's something that was very much on their minds, even though they may never have met each other or had very little interaction face to face. They still understood what, or wanted to understand what a friendship might entail.
I think part of it is where we go to problematic use of social media, or what has been called social media addiction. This is where obligation becomes problematic, is the need to, you know, on average, the sample shows that about 111 minutes is what an average college student spends daily on Facebook. And from anecdotal data, and I, you know, me being one of the participants, I have Facebook on all the time and I keep checking. So there's also a constant need to be in the loop. So that's where the obligation happens, is because, and some argue that it is replacing face-to-face communication, but I don't think it is, because this is just the same type of communication, but online. It is efficient. I can communicate with people who are away from me, people, high school friends. And as we talked about during our meeting, over the years, this is also changing. A lot of the people now are going to social media sites because they are lurkers. They want to be entertained and be in the know about what's happening. So we find the people who post a lot and the people, and a larger pool of people who are watching what is happening. So there's a constant need to be informed that I think is interesting.
I think there are a lot of people on Twitter that don't ever tweet.
Yep.
But it's a huge source of stuff. It's different from Facebook. I mean,
Yep.
You can learn an awful lot by following the right kinds of people, and you go off and read something that you never would have found without having read it on a tweet.
So tied to this idea of friendship, while we're going over to get that question, and obligation, I don't know how many of you may have been told by someone in your family that you have very few friends and lots of associates, right? And we can see that playing out in the research model, where your team is pretty close-knit, and then you have others you link out to. And so part of the thing is how do we think about who really is a friend? We're using that same word, but this idea that there's a close-knit circle that you hold fairly close, and everyone else you interact with as you need to, but you understand that there's certain information that you don't reveal, there's certain parts of yourself that you don't break down, and how much of that has maintained over time, I think, is another cut on has friendship changed. Yeah.
Now we have two more questions or comments, and then
Yep.
back to you.
I'm sure I'm showing my generational differences, but I guess I want to comment on obligation, friendship, and someone mentioned cognitive effort, and the cognitive effort expended is a lot less. I'm a letter writer, and I see cognitive effort as being nil in emails and Facebook, and when I have a conversation with my younger nieces and nephews, and there are 5 of us in a circle, and we're actually communicating face to face, and when one is texting, while we're communicating, and I call him on it, and I say, "You are being so rude." And he said, "No, I'm not." But I feel it's a cognitive effort that's not being expended because he's texting. And I guess I'm showing my age.
I think you've highlighted an issue that is definitely generational, but also intragenerational as well. I think it depends on the person and on, the interesting thing is the younger generation tend to have the myth that they are good at multitasking, and research showing that they're not. They're very poor at it. And everything comes at a cost, but there is, for some reason, there is the myth that I can multitask between 3 different media at the same time and use them and be able to grasp what's happening. We deal with that in the classroom. I mean, students are on their laptops, and about 60 or 70% of the websites that are usually open have nothing to do with the lecture. So it is an issue of education that everything comes at a cognitive cost. There's no such thing as being engaged in a conversation and texting at the same time, or texting and driving, that would lead to the person not making errors or not actually paying full attention to either task. So there's a lot that needs to be done. I mean, part of how you do it, I mean, on a larger scale, I mean, find people for texting and driving. Some countries like Israel, people are talking on the phone. While driving, you pay a fine. I mean, so policy also needs to accommodate for that. And also establishing group rules, right? So when my wife and I are out on a date, we both agree that we're going to put the phone away and turn it off. So being aware of these things and discussing them, I think, is important. But also understanding why are they doing it. There's also a benefit that they gain from texting because they need to be in the know, they need to communicate. And it is managing 2 virtual worlds at the same time that is what's happening, I assume. I hope that answered your question.
I can, even piggybacking on that, I'm thinking back to the obligations. I just think it's interesting that I think text messages and stuff also enable us to enter into obligations with one another in ways that are really positive. So I'm thinking about, like, with my roommates, it can be, hey, can you get milk? Or we have very different schedules, so we can, figure out bills or something while, one of us is at home and I'm at work or something like that. And so I think that by enabling specific forms of communication that separate us, or that enable that communication even though we're separated in time or space. I text while, right after someone interrupts me or something. It really can positively impact our relationships. And then I guess just a second thing, completely unrelated, I had written down is, I also think it's really interesting to think about how something like Facebook, like friending my boss or friending my mom, really.
Thank God Facebook was not there when I was in college.
Yeah. Well, but in a way, I think my mom is just going to have to get used to like learning things about me that she wouldn't, that her parents wouldn't know about her. I don't know if it is going to make us take each other less seriously or understand that kind of we're more nuanced than something like a letter or some form of communication like that, because it's less deliberate and less intentional. We kind of lose the ability to construct a very specific image of ourselves unless we want to construct it to everyone. I just think it's kind of interesting.
True to form, we did not solve all the questions that were raised. That was never our intent. Our intent from the start was to have a dialogue, to present perspectives from different fields, and to engage with you. And I would like to thank all of you tonight for being a part of this discussion. Part of why we do this is we think it's important to expose the campus and the community to our stars. And we're very good in academia of bringing people in from other places and holding them up and telling everybody to sit and listen to what they have to say. Well, we believe it's important that you be able to have a conversation with people right here at Michigan State University so that after tonight, you can still have conversations with them. You might decide you want to take a class with them, you want to do research with them, you want to go have coffee with them and talk more about what they're doing. And so we encourage you to not use tonight as the end of the discussion, to have discussions with each other, to take this conversation to other people, and certainly as we wrap up this evening, if you have questions for the panelists, to do come and ask them questions. And I just want to thank everyone for participating tonight, and we look forward to seeing you in February.